What are we going to talk about in this evening's masterclass? So our agenda, I'm going to really briefly introduce who Helping Irish hosts are. So for some of you, this evening's session might be your first encounter with us. We're going to look at the context of hosting in Ireland now, and then have a closer look at the moving on process. So this is our best practice that we've developed from supporting many hosts going through this sometimes difficult stage of the hosting journey. We've got a couple of case studies that we want to share with you, and then we'll stop recording and we'll invite everybody to turn their cameras on, and we'll do a question and answer session for the second half of the session. So hopefully that sounds good. Who are Helping Irish hosts? So we are an organization of, in the beginning, we were all hosts who found each other. We arose directly in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And our mission is to empower and support individuals and communities in Ireland to host displaced Ukrainian people in their homes safely and sustainably. And that's something that we've been working towards consistently for the last 2 years. We actually had our second birthday last week in Clare, and it was so nice that I stayed. So I hope you have a sunny day wherever you are in Ireland today. And yeah, as Helping Irish hosts, we've continued to develop, and we now partner with the Irish Red Cross and the Institute of Migration, the IOM. We're one of the implementing partners, part of the Ukrainian consortium in Ireland. And so the activities that we undertake are matching. So that's taking people seeking accommodation and hosts like yourselves and putting them together. Creating and sharing resources, so information like what we're sharing in our masterclass this evening, offering support to people on the hosting journey or thinking about hosting, and advocacy, so representing the interests of hosts and Ukrainian guests at all levels of government and in different aspects of Irish society. So when I talk about hosting in Ireland now, what do I mean? Well, I wanted to share some of the numbers with you so that you understand that you're part of something incredible. At the moment, these figures are from the 14th of April, so 10 days ago. Just under 106,000 Ukrainians have been granted temporary protection in Ireland, and it's estimated that approximately 78%, so just over 80,000 are currently in Ireland under the Temporary Protection Directive. And of those, just under 70,000 are in state-supported accommodation. So that's your hotels, your hostels, your community centres, and all of those spaces that were very quickly repurposed and turned into accommodation. And when we talk about hosts or pledged accommodation, there are currently over 23,000 Ukrainian people living in hosted accommodation in Ireland, and that's in almost 12,000 registered host homes, which is just huge. And when we look at that in the bigger context, so we have 28% of Ukrainians in Ireland are living in hosted or pledged accommodation. And when we look across Europe, it compares to an 8 to 9% average across the EU. And we know that the ARP payment is a big part of that, but we also know that solidarity with the Ukrainian people is a huge motivator. And it's a big reason why people have stepped up in Ireland and offered an Irish welcome to Ukrainians here. We conducted a survey last year. We had over 1,400 hosts complete the survey, and we gained some really interesting insights into the hosting experience in Ireland in it. So I wanted to share some of those with you. So 92% of hosts say that they've had a positive experience, and 76% of them would recommend hosting to others. So overwhelmingly positive. 76%, as I mentioned, were motivated to host out of solidarity with Ukrainians. and 53% plan to extend for over 1 year. And I know already from chatting to some of you that lots of you have been hosting from much longer than 1 year already. 54% of our pledges come via word of mouth. So we know that it is really important that if you're having a good hosting experience, that you are telling others about it. And we know it's one of the things that encourages people to maybe take that step if they've been thinking about it, is to have the opportunity to talk to somebody with experience. So if you're not currently hosting and you've come along just because you want to find out more about it, you're really welcome this evening as well. 80% of hosts have extended their pledge beyond 6 months, which is the minimum pledge to receive a payment. And we know that 23% of hosts that are out there and doing it in Ireland right now are what we call DIY hosts. So these are people who found somebody on social media, on or via word of mouth or personal networks, and haven't gone through an agency. And what we know, having worked for the last couple of years, is that happy, supported hosts are more likely to keep hosting and to encourage others to pledge. And that's what we want. We want a thriving host network in Ireland. And my role within Helping Irish Hosts is I lead the host support team. And these figures reflect our monthly support requests. So these are instances of people contacting us to ask for help or advice or to seek information about to support their hosting experience. So you can see there's been a pretty steady climb over the last couple of years. And if you look at the list on the right of the screen, you can see that at the top category of support requests, over the first 3 months of this year, the question of moving on is huge. It's 23% of all requests we've received relate to that. So if you're coming along because you're going to have that conversation with your guests, or you're coming to the end of your hosting journey, I guess I want to say to you that you might feel conflicted or guilty or worried about taking this next step, but it is a very normal part of the hosting journey. And it's not something that you need to feel bad about. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dervla, who is going to talk you through a bit more of the actual moving on process.
Thanks, Ger. So the process itself, as Ger was just saying, we know that our guests get worried about the moving on process. We can feel guilty. We can avoid the conversation or let things go on longer than we had intended or what we'd signed up to. Because, we worry about our guests and what the future holds, and, we have that guilt. But we just want our hosts to remember that hosting isn't meant to be forever. When we opened our homes to families in need, we weren't adopting them. Hosting doesn't equal adoption. And it's completely okay to want your privacy back, or to want your space back, or to want your holiday home back. That's okay. What you have done is amazing, and we should all be proud of ourselves. We should all be really giving ourselves a pat on the back, I think, for doing it in the first place. That's the main thing to remember. And we have loads of information on our, sorry, 1 second. Back up 1 second. Sorry, Paul. Paul, I've got a child here. Go downstairs.
And we all work from home in Helping Irish Hosts.
I am so sorry. I just had a 3-year-old. Sorry, I'm so sorry about that. But basically, we have, it's completely okay to want your life back to the way it was beforehand. So we've loads of information on this page, mostly created by myself and Angie, who are going through that our own journey of the moving on process with our guests ourselves. So we kind of created this content because we both felt it was a difficult stage of the process, and we just wanted to be able to help and support other hosts going through the same thing. We also have a dedicated section for guests on our website, and that lays out all the moving on options. And it just it highlights to them that, again, that hosting wasn't meant to be forever. And we're letting them know that the moving on and change is hard. We're here to support them, and we're just laying out all the different accommodation options for them moving forward as well. So then the conversation guide, we have detailed in quite good detail on the website the actual conversation, how we would have had our own conversations, and based on that, we developed this guide. So I suppose the main thing is to prepare for the conversation. So you need to schedule a time with the guest. I wouldn't go straight into the conversation with the guest without letting them know that, giving them a chance to think about it beforehand, and for yourself to think about it beforehand. So maybe send a text. That's what I did in my situation, and just saying something like, listen, we've loved hosting you, but we think it's time maybe to start looking at moving on options, and we would love to sit down at such and such a time and discuss that with you. So then it's really, you need to understand where you're coming from as regards asking your guests to move on. So I think it's a good idea to jot down your feelings and how the hosting experience has been for you, and what reasons you have for wanting to end the hosting period. So once you've jotted all that down or had a conversation with maybe a trusted friend, we do kind of ask hosts to kind of park that to one side, and then put yourself in your guest's shoes and think about what they might be thinking, or what their plans might be, or what questions or fears they might have for you. So just putting yourself in the guest's shoes before you go into that conversation with them. So then you're going to sit down and have the conversation with them. And we would really recommend that you would lead by asking them what their plans are. Put the ball in their court. You might think they might not have a plan, or you might think that they might have certain plans, but we don't really know until we ask the question. And it's one of those scary questions that we're always nervous about asking our guests about future plans, because we don't want to upset our guests, especially maybe when we know their intention was always to go home to Ukraine, and we know that that might not be the option available to them at the moment. So you're asking them what their plans are, you're listening and empathizing with them and informing them about their options. So listing out the various options, and we would have a list of all the particular options that we will go through going forward. And then you're helping them to plan for the future. So you're empowering them to make the right choice for them. You can support them through the process while respecting your own boundaries and your needs. So it's important for hosts, like, offer what support you're comfortable with. Some hosts decide not to be involved in the process and to leave it to their guests to work out the next steps. Some hosts are quite comfortable with being involved, and they will be there to support the guest while they're searching for options or helping to make recommendations or offer advice. But it's completely up to you. So you need to know what your boundaries are, but also remember that it's all about empowering the guests. It's their life, it's their next step of their journey, and it's important that they're the ones to make that decision. So it's kinder to be clear. So even though it doesn't always feel it, you can feel the opposite, but you do need to be upfront, be clear, be supportive, but ultimately let your guests make the decision about their own future. So the onward accommodation options. So if they want to stay in the same area, there is rental accommodation. So we would know the main websites, and we have a more detailed guide for guests on finding rental accommodation. We would also have the local, sorry, 1 minute. Sorry. Jer, could you take over for just 1 minute there, and then I'll be back?
Absolutely.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's, it's like hosting. You don't get to hide the real aspects of small children or your life. It's all good. So, yeah, if your guest has integrated in the area and is really set on staying there, then we do encourage them to start looking for rented accommodation. And as Dervla said, we have created a guide. It's in Ukrainian and it's in English, so you can also have a read if you want to know what advice they're being given in terms of how to search for accommodation in Ireland. It's also worth contacting your local authority if your guests would be able to manage living in a self-contained property. So the Offer a Home scheme, another appeal has just gone out for pledges, and that's managed by local authorities in each county, and you can contact us if you want to try to find out the contact details, the email address of your local authority in order to be able to send an email, make an inquiry, and potentially get access to a self-contained property. And then personal networks. We know this is really important in Ireland. It's often who you know rather than what you know. So using things like schools, sports clubs, religious organizations, community groups, maybe online groups, anything that your guests are connected into. And if you do want to be involved, any connections you have in your own network, to put the word out there and ask people if they're interested in hosting. If your guests are willing to move, so if they're willing to relocate, then there are additional options as well. So obviously rental accommodation is still an option. And if they can widen their search, they may find that they are able to get a good deal. Rematching via Helping Irish Hosts or a partner organisation or county council. So we do offer a rematching service, and myself or Dervla will talk you through it in a second, how that works. But it's one of many options, and realistically, we do encourage everybody, every guest, to start thinking about what next steps they want to take themselves. And often guests can have success with finding somebody who's ready to host them, but who maybe hasn't pledged before or hasn't considered hosting before. And then we can help by offering advice and talking them through the steps that are involved in becoming a host. And state accommodation is still an option. So for anybody who entered Ireland before the 14th of March this year, they do have the ability to return to state accommodation. And for some people, that might be the best next step, actually. And we have some case studies that will look at scenarios where that's been the case. As Dervla mentioned, we have our moving on information for guests all on our website. It's all in Ukrainian. And we have the in-depth guide on tips for finding accommodation in Ireland. And we also have a number of guest liaisons on our team. I know we're called the host support team, but we support guests directly as well. So at the point that you've had the moving on conversation and they understand that it's time for them to take the next step, we can have a guest liaison, have a phone call with them and talk them through their options. And this is what the rematching process looks like. So chronologically, the first step is to have...
Sure.
Hi, yes, okay, you're back.
Sorry, my husband is in trouble, but that's clear now. So yeah, the rematching process, if your guests do decide that they would like to apply for further hosted accommodation, they can apply into us. So we would need at the start for the moving on conversation to have taken place and agreed a moving out date. So it's important to have that date. We do find that guests aren't as motivated if it's kind of open-ended. It might take a long time for them to find an option, or they might keep turning down options, hoping to find something better. So they're a lot more motivated once you've got that date set. And then your guests can fill out the form. So it's quite a detailed questionnaire that we have now for guests. So they may need some assistance to fill out that form. So once we get that form, we're going to contact both the host and the guest, and the host we're really contacting for a reference. So I guess it's important for us that we were placing guests that we think are suitable for hosting. So, you know, we're helping Irish hosts. We are to help our hosts, and we're here to protect our hosts also. So if we really think that maybe a guest isn't suitable, we will you know, maybe decide against rehosting a guest. So we are asking the host, you know, how was your experience of hosting the guest? How are they doing? How are they doing in terms of integration? If there's been any problems. And it's not that we're turning away a lot of guests in that respect. It'd only be very occasionally that we would think maybe the state system might be more suitable for a particular guest, or they might have too high a level of needs for another host to take on. And then it's about 6 to 8 weeks before the actual move out date is when we pass it over to the matching team, and they will actually begin to start looking for a host for your guest. So we do know from experience that, you know, different profiles of guests are a lot easier to match than others. So for example, if your guests have a car, that really opens up a lot of self-contained properties that we would have, and that would need a car to get around because there mightn't be local link bus services. Similarly, single guests, you know, a lot of the pledges that come in now are for guests for one person. So we would have a bit of a problem with some higher level needs or different dynamics of families. For example, like older people are becoming a bit harder to find placements for, and maybe a mother with expecting a baby or with a very young child. Some dynamics are just more difficult. We will always try our best, but it's not, we will try to be realistic with the host on the reference call or with the guest from the outset. And we're telling them straight away to look at all these other options, because we know a lot of the times they want to stay in the same area, and we just can't always. We will always look in the same area again, but we can't guarantee that we will be able to find something. So the best ways is to go through local networks. And if your guest finds a host themselves that doesn't really know much about the ARP or hosting, we're more than happy to talk people through that, or even potentially match them through our process, so the guest and the host are supported through that. And then hopefully if they've accepted an offer, we move to moving day. And then it's, we're hoping to, a lot of you, to keep in contact with ourselves. And the main thing is to put out the message, even if you're not hosting anymore, is to share your experience. We know that's what brings more hosts in. So if you've had a good hosting experience, just to put the word out about us or about hosting, and that it can be a really, it can be a really fulfilling experience to have. And then in terms of moving on outcomes, we do try and track where our guests move to if a match has ended. So this graph now would show us that 37% moved to further hosted accommodation, 17% returned to Ukraine, 16% return to City West accommodation, so state accommodation. Most of your guests will be able to. So if there's no accommodation sorted by their moving out date, most guests will be able to go to City West and avail of state accommodation there. So, we often hear from hosts that, I don't want to put my guests out on the street. That very, very, very rarely happens, that is the case, that there is nowhere for a guest to go. So there is always somewhere for your guests to go. And then sometimes 5% go to another country, 3.5% go to rental accommodation. Unfortunately, that figure is still quite low, but we're hoping that will improve. And that's it. So I think we're going to go on to some case studies then of some hosts and guests who have been through this process.
Yes, thanks, Derv. So we thought it would be helpful to give you some specific examples. These are cases that we've supported guests to move on in the last 6 months or so, to give you an idea of what it looks like and what is possible. So the first example is of Mary, Oksana, and her sons. So we've not gotten their explicit consent to share this story, so we've changed some of the details, but it's a real scenario. So Mary hosted Oksana, who's a young mother with 2 sons under the age of 5, in a self-contained property in Roscommon. And Mary was a very supportive host, but Oksana did struggle with some of the aspects of independent living. So she had some challenges around getting her bank account set up. She didn't have any English at all. And there were some things around setting up bills that we took into consideration when we were thinking about what the best next step was for her. And we had been supporting her. We'd linked her with a local Ukrainian support worker, as well as one of our own guest liaisons, to help navigate some of these things. But ultimately, there was damp ingress in the self-contained property. And when we investigated further, and when Mary got a builder to come and look at it, it became apparent that actually it would be extremely expensive to repair it, and the property wasn't suitable for a young mum and her 2 little boys. So for that reason, we agreed a move out date with Mary and Oksana, and we did look for a new hosted arrangement to see if there would be something that would perhaps offer a bit more support to Oksana, and also would be suitable for a mum and 2 kids. Unfortunately, as Dervla's just mentioned, there's not a huge amount of people pledging to look to share with young families anymore. And so a rematch wasn't possible when we had checked. We advised that a return to state accommodation was best. Initially, Oksana was not keen on the idea, but ultimately it was her best option. She returned to state accommodation, and it has actually turned out to be a much less stressful experience. And she does still hope to. She has a friend who's coming to Ireland, and she hopes that once they've actually come over, they'll seek accommodation together where they can share bills and they can have some mutual support with childcare and so on. And then our second case study is of Sheila and Tony, our hosts, and they hosted Katerina and Elisa. Katerina and her daughter Elisa, who's 6 years old, and they hosted them for a year and a half in their home in Carlow. And when Kate's husband Ilya arrived from Ukraine, it became apparent that the wee family, there was not enough space in the shared home. And so they had the moving on conversation at that point. And Kate and Ilya and Elisa were very set on staying in the same area because they had really become part of the local community. And you can see a quote from Tony there saying that it was a lot harder than we envisaged it would be, because Sheila and Tony really took it upon themselves to try and support the family to find somewhere in the locality so they wouldn't have to relocate. It took them a total of 3 months, and they eventually helped them find something which meant they could stay nearby and Elisa could stay in school. This is a further quote from Sheila and Tony. So after seeking and failing to find a rental, they placed a heartfelt note from Kate about how much they want to stay in the community and what it means to them. And they put that up in local shops and local newsletters. And within a week, they found a property. So a self-contained apartment in a neighbour's garden. And some of the people who responded to the note that they'd placed in the local area, they didn't know about the ARP scheme at all. And their new host had originally planned to rent that property. But when he became aware of the ARP, he was willing to accept that instead of rent. And Sheila and Tony have offered some advice for people who are coming to the moving on part of their hosting journey. So they caution against too much hand-holding with guests. So again, it's that approach of empowering your guests to make their own decisions, asking them what their plans are, giving them information about the Irish context and supporting them to make their own decisions. They advise that you should have the moving on conversation as early as possible. And I would say that's certainly true if your guests hope to stay in the same area, to give them a good amount of notice. However, you do need to, as they say, be kind but firm. Your guests might feel anxious. So it's really good to have a set date that you know you're working towards, and then just check in regularly with them to see how their accommodation search is going. Spread the word and use all of your connections. So you never know who is out there considering hosting, who just hasn't taken the final step yet. And then give them space and time to settle on their own once they've moved on. And I love this because they say, allow the relationship to turn into something new. And it's something that we hear about all the time. It's something that people in our organization that I've hosted see and talk about, that your relationship will change into something new and different and, you know, just as lovely. You might not see them as much, but that's okay, you know. So we're going to wrap up the presentation section now. And the key points that we'd love you to take away are that moving on is a normal part of the hosting journey. It's just another step. That being clear is being kind. So as a host, you might feel awkward about approaching that moving on conversation, but really the clarity that you're offering your guests by having a direct and open conversation about it, that where you've considered it fully, is a kindness in the long run. That word of mouth is powerful, so please do share your hosting experience and encourage others to host. And remember that you're not alone. So Helping Irish Hosts, we're here to support you, whether we made your match or you're a DIY host or you were matched by one of our implementing partners. You can reach out to us for support at any time. We have a summary of resources here, and we're going to send the presentation around so you can have a look through it at your leisure. But we have our Facebook, we have ongoing online drop-ins and masterclasses similar to this. There's an e-newsletter that you can sign up for. Roadshow sessions, we had one in Offaly last night, and we have ones coming up, not in Kilkenny. This is a slightly older slide, but we have upcoming ones in Donegal, Leitrim, Cork is the next one happening in early May. So again, you'll be updated on the newsletter if you sign up, or drop us an email and ask us where we're coming to next. We have our website, which is full of really useful information, and we have some contact details there on how you can reach out to us by phone, by WhatsApp, or by email, and follow us on social media. Okay, over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing the presentation now, and we're going to stop recording.